Marcus was a man in his 30s, a former rescuer who, after years of adventures and episodes of danger, decided to exchange the rush of rescue operations for a quieter life in the small town of Ironwood, located on the border between Utah and Wyoming. His previous profession had given him a certain physical and mental resistance. Still, nothing had prepared him for what was to come in this isolated region, known for its dense old forests full of long-forgotten secrets. Marcus's routine now consisted of tending to an old farm inherited from a distant aunt, situated on the edge of a cavernous clearing, where tall trees stood like silent sentinels, forming a gloomy, almost intimidating environment. The atmosphere of the place was charged with something inexplicable, with a constant sense of observation, as if the land itself held ancestral secrets that should not be disturbed. The wind blew strongly, often carrying whispers that seemed to come from within the trees, and the sound of the churning leaves sounded more like ancestral conversation than a simple breeze. Spurred by rumors that the nearby forest was a hotbed of unexplained activity, Marcus soon began to notice details that added to his sense of unease. Always attentive, he spent his nights with the shadow of a dim lantern illuminating the paths, while trying to understand the silent messages of that mysterious environment. On one of these nights, something changed. It was a full moon night, and as Marcus walked along the edge of the property, a feeling that something was watching him intensely dominated his body. Suddenly, he heard a distinct sound, like a distant whisper or a sigh coming from within the trees. It sounded like a soft, barely audible call, but charged with a disturbing urgency. His breathing became heavier, and a shiver ran down his spine. Cautiously, he tried to track down the source of the sound, but it was as if the trees closed around him, creating a dark labyrinth that seemed to move and transform with every step he took. This sound, though barely perceptible, seemed to approach him, as if some ancient entity was playing with his head. Marcus felt his heart race, his mind struggling to rationalize the inexplicable. Was it an animal, a natural phenomenon, or something darker, which concealed its presence under the guise of an ordinary forest? An irresistible sense of suspense overwhelmed him, an anxiety that deepened at every moment. In this climate of mystery and fear, he realized that that night would mark a turning point. The invisible threat began to creep in subtly, weaving a veil of suspense around him, leaving him with the question, how far did it go beyond his comprehension? Was he about to discover once and for all the secrets hidden within that ancient forest, where creatures of shadow and ancient legends seemed to wait in the dim light, ready to emerge again? The fear of that growing mystery began to turn into a real threat, a presence that hid in the darkness, waiting for its moment to reveal itself. In the weeks following that strange encounter in the woods, Marcus began to realize that something had indeed altered his perception of the world around him. Small details, which once seemed insignificant, now gained a terrifying weight. As he walked through the fields around the farm at dusk, he noticed shadows that seemed to move against his will, almost as if they were watching him, even when the sky was clear. Boulders and trees seemed to move around, forming odd angles, and the distant sound of footsteps or something crawling seemed to be always present, even in the absence of any animal or person around. The feeling of being watched had become something everyday, an invisible presence that haunted him every hour of the day, heightening his anxiety. At first, Marcus tried to explain everything logically. Frightened animals, light reflections, wind effects, or even his mental fatigue. But as the days passed, the signs became more intense and disconcerting. Strange marks began to appear on the farm's wooden enclosure, scribbled lines, almost like scratches made by human hands, but which grew deeper and more chaotic each morning, as if an unknown force were trying to communicate something. The nights, previously relatively quiet, became a challenge. He began to hear scratches on the wall, light footsteps that seemed to move around him when he tried to sleep. On one of these occasions, as he looked out the window, he had the impression of seeing a tall, slender silhouette with arms too long for an ordinary human being, standing among the nearest trees, with bright eyes that reflected his flashlight momentarily. These signs, although disturbing, were still too ambiguous. Marcus insisted that it was all his imagination, a natural reaction to the isolation and strain of living in such a remote place. After all, no concrete evidence was presented, only these small blows to his rationality. But deep inside, he felt that something older and darker was moving there. In the following days, the phenomena began to happen more frequently. Objects that disappeared and reappeared in different locations, trees that seemed to create human forms, such as deformed faces, or figures that moved silently in the hope of being seen. The feeling that there was an evil presence in the forest grew by the moment, although Marcus tried to remain calm. His concern for his own sanity also increased as he struggled to understand whether what he saw was real or the product of his imagination. The question that plagued him and kept him suspenseful was, why did all this happen? What secrets did that forest hide? From reports from locals about encounters with dark entities to ancient legends about beings capable of assuming human forms and manipulating their victims, the mystery began to accumulate without a clear answer. The nagging feeling that something was beyond his comprehension intensified as the shadow forms seemed to silently approach, becoming more and more difficult to dismiss as mere illusions. Marcus, his metabolism accelerated by fear, found himself trapped in a trap of doubts, trying to avoid the frightening certainty that a supernatural force, a creature of the shadows or even an ancient entity, was awakening in that forest that seemed alive, and that now seemed to also want to awaken in him a battle between reason and terror. As the weeks passed, Marcus's restlessness turned into a deep anxiety that seemed to infect every breath. The constant feeling that something was watching him, even in the relative safety of his home, corroded his inner peace. Each morning, when he found unusual marks on the fence or heard light, distant footsteps on the silent nights, an icy chill took over his body. Fear was no longer a passing sensation, but a lingering presence that took root in his mind, growing uncontrollably. In the silence of the night, he found himself plunged into a whirlwind of emotions, the dread of not understanding what was going on, the impotence of fighting against something unknown, and the anguish of not finding any rational explanation. Each darker shadow seemed to take on a menacing shape, and his heart raced more and more as he felt that the very forest around his farm seemed to compact, as if it were closing in to envelop that place, and perhaps even himself. A disturbing memory came back to the surface. One night, while trying to sleep, he heard a heavy drag coming from inside the forest, as if something giant was moving slowly, blinking in the dim light, attentive. His breath became short, his body tense, and for a moment he felt the presence of an invisible force approaching, almost as if it was hidden under his skin, ready to emerge. Fear became almost a shadow that charged his spirit, a sense of growing vulnerability in the face of a threat that he could not see, could not touch, but whose effects were felt in increasingly bizarre and frightening ways. Like a prisoner of his own thoughts, Marcus struggled to keep a cool head, trying to rationalize every event, but everything seemed to conspire against him. The feeling that his life was somehow being threatened by an ancient force, of an entity that fed on the climate of fear and suffering, grew stronger every night. And the more he tried to convince himself that it was all the result of his emotions or isolation, the more the evidence seemed to contradict this theory. Objects fell from high places for no apparent cause. Trees seemed to murmur him with their high-pitched dissonant noises, and shadows lengthened in a way that disoriented his sense of reality. The feeling of helplessness became unbearable. Sometimes, Marcus found himself bathing in cold water, trying to expel fear from his body, while his mind was filled with obsessive thoughts about what might be hiding there in the forest, waiting for the moment to strike. He felt increasingly vulnerable, like a prey that knows that something dangerous is lurking its nights and days, but that it cannot escape or understand the threat. Most unsettling of all was the impotence of knowing that, no matter how much his instincts screamed for answers, he could do nothing. Danger seemed to grow invisibly around him, hidden in the dim light, eager to reveal his true form. And even though he was scared to death, a part of him still resisted, hoping that it was all just an illusion, a long night of nightmares that would soon pass. But the feeling that the threat was concrete, real and close, began to take root, deep in his heart, leaving him one step away from an emotional crisis that could compromise his own sanity. Over the days, Marcus began to realize that invisible presence was not static, but rather a being that molded itself to his perceptions and the surrounding environment. Small changes in the behavior of the shadows and the sounds of the forest indicated a kind of constant adaptation, as if the creatures responsible were evolving or learning from it. The trees, once silent, seemed at times to emit almost incomprehensible whispers, which alternated between the wind and something else. Long, distorted shadows seemed to lengthen each night, taking shapes he couldn't clearly identify, but which suggested an intelligence that adjusted to his deepest fears. An overwhelming sense that danger was no longer just a vague threat, but a force that molded itself to become more efficient in its pursuit, grew within him. Marcus began to find marks and possibilities for communication that seemed more than coincidences, winding lines and strange symbols scratched on the wood or stones near his house. Sometimes he saw in the forest a presence that moved silently, its contours almost indistinguishable, but which seemed to be always at the right distance, as if he were studying his every move, every hesitation. The threat, enhanced by these signs, increased his anxiety as he began to understand that it would not go away on its own. The most disturbing phenomena were the fragmentary apparitions of tall, pale-skinned, piercing eyes, which appeared rapidly in the dim light and disappeared before he could see the full. Some nights he believed he heard low voices, whispers that seemed to come from multiple directions, like forgotten language or mental blackmail. These voices, mixed with distorted sounds, gave the impression that supernatural forces were adapting to their fear, as if sending out more elaborate versions of their threats, setting the stage for something greater that had not yet been fully revealed. The feeling that these creatures or forces had the ability to transform and hide in their own environment intensified, leaving Marcus with a distressing question. Was he dealing with something that had undergone a silent evolution? Something that learns from your fears and tries to manipulate your mind and the space around you? Each night had brought a new clue, an unusual footprint, a change in the texture of the ground, a shadow that seemed to take on a life of its own as it receded into the dim light. This evidence, though not fully understood, indicated that the forces in that grove were adapting, growing in intelligence and subtle aggressiveness, and that their hiding place might be getting closer and closer to revealing itself. The more Marcus tried to deny it, the deeper the mystery went, fueling a sense that the real danger was not just an isolated entity, but a system of forces that could be evolving, planning their invisible continuity in the darkness. And so, the fear that had once been just a sensation became a silent conviction. This was a real threat, disguised in the shadows, and that adapted, learned, and possibly prepared for its next offensive. Gradually, Marcus began to feel that his own mind was betraying his perception of reality. Events that once seemed just signs of something supernatural now began to look like distortions of his own consciousness. Moments when she was sure of what she saw, a shadow moving fast through the trees, a sound of heavy footsteps near her window, seemed to dissolve into the fog of her doubt. His vision became a double-edged sword. Sometimes the shadows seemed sharper, more threatening, but at other times he doubted everything, questioning whether it was all an illusion created by his fear or the fatigue of living in isolation. As the paranoia increased, the environment around her seemed to transform in a subtle but unsettling way. The trees in the forest, which had previously seemed just a part of the scenery, now seemed to bend slowly, as if they were alive and adjusting to their emotions. The shadows, once ambiguously frightening, now took on colors and shapes that looked like fakes. The horizon lines distorted before his gaze, and ordinary objects, the chair, the door, the floor itself, seemed to be constantly changing, as if reality were unraveling before his eyes. At one point, the wooden fence seemed to be solid and firm. The next, it seemed to flutter, as if it were about to disappear into the very essence of space. His sense of control faded along with his sense of stability, leaving him with a painful confusion. He began to doubt whether he had seen it or whether his fear had driven him mad. The sounds, too, have been transformed. The whispers of the wind became muffled screams, voices that seemed to speak or perhaps scream inside his head. And that constant whisper that seemed to come from the forest, once a mystery, now seemed like his invention, a distorted voice of his own anxiety. But there were times when Marcus's own sensations became so distorted that he had difficulty distinguishing what was an illusion from what was actually happening. Daylight, which had previously seemed normal, now emitted an erratic luminosity. The atmosphere of the environment seemed to be charged with an invisible energy, as if space itself was bending to hide some truth that he could not understand. His mind struggled desperately to find explanations, but each attempt only worsened the sense of disorientation. He wondered if it was all a manifestation of his own fear, or if there really were strange forces manipulating his perception. The more he tried to keep his sanity, the more the boundaries between reality and imagination became fragile and unstable. At one point, he found himself watching a shadow that emerged from within the wall, as if it were forming there, waiting to attack him. In another, he had the impression of hearing distant and indecipherable laughter echoing throughout the farm, although nothing was there. His perception had become a dense fog, a web of confusion that robbed him of his understanding of himself and the world around him. After all, he questioned whether he was really living an invasion of supernatural forces, or if he had simply lost himself in the illusion of his own cunning and cruel mind. The fine line between what is true and what is imagined disappeared more and more, leaving Marcus at the mercy of an increasingly changing and frightening reality. On the darkest night yet, Marcus knew his fight for survival would reach its breaking point. From weeks of being chased by shadows that adapted, he felt that the line between reality and nightmare had narrowed to the maximum. His senses were heightened, every sound seemed amplified, and the invisible presence seemed almost palpable, pressing down on his thoughts and emotions. With his heart almost bursting in his chest, he armed himself with a flashlight, an ancient axe, and a desperate determination to uncover the truth behind the forces that troubled his life. The surrounding environment looked like a living entity, the entire forest breathing with muffled sighs under the full moon. The trees, once almost silent, now creaked and bent, as if trying to hide or protect what was being dug in the darkness. Marcus began to move forward, each step more determined and frightened at the same time, feeling like a victim who enters the dungeon of his own nightmare. Then suddenly a colossal shadow appeared before him, a pale, irregular figure with red eyes that shone in the immensity of the night. It was the incarnation of the dark monster, a creature that looked like a fusion of shadow and flesh, capable of transforming at will. His muscles tensed, and his survival instincts opened a channel of courage he didn't even know he possessed. Marcus raised his axe, trembling but determined not to be overwhelmed by that terror. The creature charged forward with frightening speed, almost as if it were playing hunter, and its long arms stretched out to grab it. A cry of pure anguish escaped his lips as he lunged aside, narrowly dodging the onslaught. At that moment, an internal battle began, a struggle for the mind and the spirit. The outside threat tried to absorb him, swallowing his reason with somber snores and laughter, while his soul screamed for resistance. Marcus knew he couldn't just fight physically. He needed to hurt that in his essence, cutting off whatever was his source of power, his connection with the shadow. In a last-ditch effort, he recalled an old local legend about rituals and estrangements, attempts to banish evil forces. With a willpower that tried to overcome paralyzing fear, he began to shout words he did not understand in an attempt to repel what at first seemed invincible. His voice echoed in the darkness, amplifying against the silent forest. The creature responded with a deep howl, a mixture of pain and anger, before its shadow began to disintegrate as if it were being pulled into an abyss. For a moment, all was silent. Marcus, panting, with his body marked by scratches and bated breath, realized that the threat had been temporarily defeated. But a fierce doubt remained. Was this the final battle, or the first of many? As he gazed at the sky, marked by clouds that were beginning to dissipate, he knew that the terror had no end, that his fight against the shadow monster was not yet over. What remained now was the doubt of whether it was all really over, or if it was just hiding, waiting for the moment to return with even more force and violence. After the intense confrontation with the creature of the shadows, Marcus lay there, lying on the ground, panting, his heart beating hard like a drum beating at the last beat. The night, which until minutes before had seemed laden with immediate danger, now seemed to be in a strange, almost expectant silence. Slowly, he tried to type up a routine he would use to catch his breath and make sense of what had just happened, but the truth was that inside, his world had changed completely. The threat had been temporarily removed, yes, but the sense that something much older and more powerful still hovered on the fringes of his perception seemed stronger than ever. As he tried to gather his emotions, a series of thoughts ran over him. Why had he been chosen to face that? How had such an ancient force anchored itself there in those isolated lands? And above all, what would happen if it returned? The idea that he could be alone in that survival game was beginning to weigh on his conscience. Looking around, the scene looked desolate. Trees destroyed, the ground covered with broken branches, and marks of struggle that seemed almost to illuminate his temporary defeat. His body ached, precarious, bruised by scratches and moments of panic, but his mind screamed even louder. Perhaps worst of all was the uncertainty. That nothing else in the environment could be trusted, that reality itself had become a web of shadows and illusions. The forest around him seemed to move subtly, as if it was alive and watching, waiting for its next weakness. Still in that state of furious reflection, Marcus wondered if it had all been just a manifestation of his own fear, a hallucination created by his exhausted mind, or a real force that aimed to fill a void in his soul, desperate for control. But even so, an inner voice insisted. The fight was not over. It just changed shape. The memories of the tense atmosphere, of his accelerated breathing, of moments that almost made him lose his sanity, remained clear, fueling constant doubt. In the silence that followed, he realized that his act of facing the creature had been more out of desperate need than courage. an attempt to maintain his humanity in the face of what seemed like an incomprehensible and indomitable force. Now, with time slowly passing, he wondered what his next move would be. Stay there, flee, or try to somehow understand it all. Sitting in the dust of the floor, contemplating the darkness, his body pulsated with a mixture of relief and deep fear, knowing that he had not yet fully defeated the threat. What had happened there, in the heart of that night, had changed his view of the world forever. The shadow still hovered, silent, waiting for an opportunity to manifest again, and he, even exhausted, knew that he would need to prepare himself. Because his confrontation had only just begun, the question turned into an unanswered question. Had he really won, or just delayed the return of a force that would live in darkness forever? The answer remained hidden in the dim light, where fear and doubt were based on an unsettling uncertainty. Even after his desperate battle, Marcus felt that the true mystery still remained buried beneath layers of shadow and silence. Some clues had been pieced together, fragments of truths that now reflected in his mind like broken mirrors. He discovered short, deep marks on the ground, symbols scratched on trees, and signs of an intelligence that silently adapted. But the more he tried to understand what he had faced, the more he was faced with unanswered questions. Who or what exactly were these shadowy creatures? How did they manage to camouflage themselves so well in the forest, taking on different forms and manipulating the very nature around them? And perhaps most unsettlingly, why did everything seem to indicate that this ancient force had a direct link to the stories of ancient native tribes, accounts of beings that could take on human forms and cause disease or madness? These questions formed a web of complex puzzles, leaving Marcus with a sense that what he discovered was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. And that, although he managed to repel a threat, his fight was not yet over. While searching the old farm, he found an old notebook hidden under a loose floor in the wooden hut. The pages were yellowed by time, but the writing was still clear. They contained accounts from an ancestor, a local sheriff, who had investigated strange disappearances in the region decades ago. Between the lines, Marcus noticed mentions of a force that fed on fear, an entity that altered perceptions and would manipulate the living to fuel their existence. Each revelation seemed to reinforce his sense that this force was not just a legend, but an evolving presence that adapted to time, stories, and human minds. Still, several questions remained unanswered. Why did the shadow choose this region? How did it reproduce or strengthen? And what would be the next step in your fight against this unknown evil? What else did it hide under the surface? The feeling that they were facing something much bigger than a shadow monster was beginning to take hold. Before finishing, Marcus noticed one last clue, an inscription almost hidden on the basement wall made with charcoal. The truth is, in the shadows you can't see. It was a cryptic message that sent a shiver down his spine. Putting it behind him seemed impossible, because he knew that the threat had not yet been fully revealed. There were secrets buried in the memories of those who came before him, and some ancient force longed to reconstitute itself, hidden in the shadows. And at the same time, he was sure that the worst was yet to come. A greater shadow, a deeper revelation, could be preparing to emerge. Marcus stood there, on the edge of the unknown, knowing that his battle against the shadow monster was still just the beginning. Because, after all, the biggest secret still remained hidden in the darkness, waiting for the moment to surface. In the heart of a remote region of Colorado, where mountains are lost among dense mists and ancient trees seem to whisper forgotten secrets, lives Ethan Carter, a 40-year-old former educator who now works as a park ranger. His silent and isolated routine gives him a deep familiarity with the surrounding wild environment, a vastness of forests, rivers, and rocks that seem to breathe a life of their own. Despite the beauty of Black Pines, the tranquility of that place has never been completely calm. Something in the atmosphere seemed to carry a kind of old weight, a sense that not everything there was natural. Ethan has always been skeptical of stories of supernatural creatures or local legends, preferring to rely on science and logic. But as time passed, a growing restlessness lodged in his mind. Everything changed one winter night when a strange presence began to subtly creep in. It was a cold night, the sky laden with dense clouds that blocked the starlight. Ethan was walking along a narrow trail that crossed an area of dense forest, known to locals as the Valley of Whispers, due to the noises that echoed through the trees. As he walked, he noticed a feeling of being watched. There was nothing different about the landscape, but his instinct told him that something was with him in the shadow. When he stopped to rest for a moment, he noticed a change in the environment. The air felt heavier, almost as if it was charged with an unknown energy. A distant, barely audible whisper invaded his ears. Indistinct speech, which seemed to come from within the trees, but without a clear origin. Ethan tried to dismiss it as an effect of his imagination, or perhaps the cold, but the feeling of discomfort only increased. Then his gaze was drawn by a strange movement in the dark. A tall, thin and deformed silhouette immediately caught his attention. It looked like a shadow that stretched and moved with an abnormal slowness, almost as if it were playing with the limit between the visible and the invisible. When he tried to focus better, she disappeared, leaving an unsettling silence in the air. Ethan took a deep breath, aware that something different from that night was starting to creep into his routine. The sense of threat deepened, arousing a frenzied curiosity, though fear tried to stifle her. He thought it might be an ordinary beast, a hallucination caused by isolation or severe cold, but a persistent restlessness told him otherwise. That shadow, that silent presence, seemed to stop at the border between the real and the invisible world. And perhaps it was beginning to move beyond the limit of what Ethan believed possible. With his heart racing, he wondered if this was just the beginning of something that would change his understanding of the world. Something ancient, dark, and dozing in the dim light, awaiting its next appearance. The night, hitherto silent, seemed to carry a promise of mystery and danger, while the unknown slowly began to leave more clues of its unsettling presence. As the days passed, Ethan began to realize that the strange events were not mere coincidences or illusions brought on by isolation. Small things changed in his routine, but together they created a feeling that something incomplete and threatening slowly infiltrated his reality. Objects that were in one place the next morning were moved or with different marks. A stone from the stream next to him, which he remembered having placed there to mark the trail, disappeared without explanation, then reappeared at a very distant point. These small changes became more and more frequent, and each carried a bewildering weight. In addition, Ethan began to notice that some sounds, once familiar, were turning into something strange. Strolling through the woods at night, he would hear indistinct whispers or footsteps that seemed to fall silent as soon as he directed his attention to them. On certain mornings, there were footprints on the ground that seemed to belong to no known animal in the area. Long, misshapen prints with marks that seemed to tear through the earth, as if a greater force were moving there that night. These clues fueled his doubts, creating an immense internal conflict between the desire to rationalize everything and the feeling that something supernatural was manifesting before his eyes. Still trying to keep his cool, Ethan convinced himself that perhaps it was all a product of his exhaustion or imagination. After all, he lived in a wild environment where large animals such as elk and wolves could explain many of these occurrences. But even when he tried to deny the evidence, an intuition insisted that he was dealing with something beyond the natural. a presence that adapted to their perceptions, that hid in every shadow and moved silently in the darkness. Her restlessness increased as certain nights seemed heavier, charged with a disturbing energy. The whispers became clearer and sometimes seemed to call him by name, as if some ancient being was trying to attract his attention. Still, he held out hope that it was only a passing phase, an illusion created by his fear and isolation. But as I tried to rationalize, the evidence kept piling up, trees deformed by inexplicable marks, shadows that stretched where they shouldn't, sounds that seemed to come from within the land itself, an invisible, silent threat that seemed to be adjusting intelligently. Ethan began to feel a chill down his spine as he realized that the thing he feared might be closer than he imagined, hidden in the dim light and preparing to show itself. He knew that the mystery he faced could no longer be ignored. Every signal, every noise was no longer just a passing doubt, but a piece of a puzzle too scary for his mind to fully comprehend. And meanwhile, the shadow remained there, waiting, in the dim light, silent, as he tried to figure out how far this threat could go. The greatest secret still lurked in the darkness, and the understanding of its true extent seemed increasingly distant. With each new morning, Ethan found himself more consumed by uncontrollable anxiety. The fear that had once seemed like a passing feeling had now turned into a constant shadow, weighing on her shoulders all the time. Every sound in the forest, a crack, a whisper, or even absolute silence, seemed charged with an invisible threat, as if something was silently approaching to attack him. The feeling of vulnerability grew by the minute, and he wondered if some ancient strength, something he couldn't explain, really watched him closely. His thoughts became a roller coaster of emotions. On the one hand, the attempt to rationalize events, thinking that everything was the result of isolation, fatigue, or even fear that he himself nurtured. On the other, an inner voice insisted that this was more than illusions, that a presence of unknown strength and evil was really there and growing stronger in the darkness. His self-doubt about his own sanity only fueled fear. The nights, once silent, became torture. Ethan would spend hours lying in bed, his breathing heavy and his head full of dark images. As he stared at the ceiling, he felt a sense that someone or something was invading his mind, threatening his emotional stability. Increasingly, the feeling that he was being pursued by a force that adapted to his emotions left him distressed. The idea that he had no power to stop it added to his despair, a sense of almost physical powerlessness. His eyes were fixed on the shadows, looking for some clue, some movement that could give him an answer, but everything remained silent, opaque, as if it was playing with him, hiding in the dim light, waiting for the moment to reveal itself completely. Ethan felt his body fill with an icy cold, his hands trembled, and a sense of claustrophobia lodged in his throat. A silent hopelessness seized him, for he did not know what it was exactly, nor what to do to escape. Each day felt like a fight against a threat that remained untouched, invisible, ambushed in the forest itself or in his subconscious. With each step, he seemed weaker, almost as if the very presence of the shadows was draining his life force. Even though he tried to convince himself that it was all just a hallucination or a reaction to his isolation, that sense of real danger deepened within him. Fear became a constant companion, an insidious pain that corroded their emotions, their confidence, their hope of overcoming that unknown threat. His mind, once clear, was now filled with doubts. Was he himself on the verge of a breakdown? Or did that invisible force really feed on your fears and adjust by the minute? The anxiety grew more intense, like a rope tightening around his neck, putting him on the edge of a psychological precipice. Ethan felt the weight of an invisible threat approaching, a force that could transform, hide, but that certainly had an intention that he did not yet understand. And so the fear and anxiety grew, growing in silence, leaving him completely vulnerable in the darkness that seemed to have no end. As the days passed, Ethan realized that the supernatural manifestations were not simple passing hallucinations or effects of isolation, but an adaptation that seemed to evolve each night. The shadows in the forest not only hid, but also changed in subtle ways, taking on contours that seemed almost human, as if they were entities that had learned to camouflage themselves in the dim light. As he tried to understand, new clues emerged. Marks on the floor, which had previously seemed only natural, now displayed intricate patterns like ancient symbols or indecipherable messages, scratched out with some hidden intention. The surrounding forest seemed more alive than ever. The branches moved with an almost intelligent slowness, and the trees, which seemed silent, sometimes produced noises that resembled indistinct voices, whispers that echoed from within the shadows. These manifestations were not restricted to the nights. Ethan felt that the forces were adjusting to his fear, growing in intensity silently, always on the margins of his conscious awareness. As if these creatures or forces had a goal of integrating themselves into your routine, of becoming more and more present. Some nights he swears he saw a tall, pale, almost translucent figure moving among the trees, always at the corner of his field of vision, disappearing when he tried to focus better. Other moments, distant sounds, heavy footsteps, guttural laughter, inaudible grunts, seemed to be approaching, like a threat that grew in size and strength with each passing day. Ethan was beginning to understand that the forces he faced were not simple manifestations of fear, but an intelligence that adapted to his actions and emotions, as if he were learning to manipulate the invisible spaces around him. This silent threat seemed to be transforming, becoming more assertive, more experienced in this game of hide and reveal. The feeling that everything was moving in the direction of a greater revelation only increased his apprehension. Like a shadow that splits and adapts to the dimmer lights, the creatures or supernatural forces seemed closer and closer to showing themselves completely. Everything indicated that they were evolving, preparing for a definitive manifestation, although their true purpose remained shrouded in mystery. Ethan had his suspicions, but no concrete proof. The vivid images of shapes that deformed, of murmurs that turned into muffled screams, reinforced the idea of an intelligence that fed on fear, molding itself to the emotions of those who tried to resist. Even though he didn't fully understand its nature, he knew that the hidden forces were there, adjusting with a silent ferocity, like predators learning to hunt their prey in the eternal dim light. And the feeling that a great revelation was approaching, but still hidden in the fog, left Ethan on the verge of greater terror. A threat that evolved in the shadows, always one step ahead of any attempt at defense or understanding. Thus, the presence of these supernatural forces intensified, leaving him to doubt how far reality and the imaginary were confused, and how far the invisible threat actually threatened to survive the boundaries of what he could comprehend. After weeks of confronting shadows and strange sounds that seemed to transform each night, Ethan began to doubt everything he saw and heard. His perception, once reliable and steady, now seemed distorted, as if a vague, unsettling mist enveloped his senses. Small changes in the landscape. A tree that had once been straight now seemed leaning or moving subtly, as if adjusting to an invisible force. The objects around him, which had always been in the same place, began to look out of place, as if they had gained their own will to change position while he was not looking. The marks on the ground, which he swore were those of crude and grotesque creatures, seemed to disappear or slowly transform, leaving him with the feeling that everything around him was alive, breathing in secret. Ethan realized that sometimes the noises he heard, footsteps, whispers, distant laughter, were no longer reliable. At times he seemed to hear voices whispering his name, but when he tried to concentrate, they disappeared, replaced by the disturbing silence of an empty forest. His head was confused, losing the boundary between the real and the imagined. The trees seemed to come close to each other, forming dark corridors that, almost like corridors in a labyrinth, led him along paths he did not know. The wind, which had previously brought only gentle waves, now seemed to carry distorted voices, as if the forest were talking to him, revealing secrets that no one should hear. Each step he took seemed to take him deeper into a reality that was unraveling before his eyes. The shadows, once only threatening, now seemed like forms that multiplied, cracking the space between what was possible and what was pure illusion. Ethan was trying to rationalize the phenomena. A combination of fear, fatigue, or the effects of isolation, he thought. But the more he tried to convince himself, the more the perception became messed up, and he found himself questioning his senses. Did it all really happen? Or was it a production of his mind on the verge of collapse? The environment around him became a mixture of real scenes and frightening visions, almost like a bad dream that he couldn't wake up from. The trees took on monstrous shapes. The sounds became too distant or too close, interspersing between reality and an unknown dimension. Ethan felt an invisible force manipulate his perception, creating a sensory experience that threatened to destroy him from within. His head was spinning, and he found himself sinking deeper and deeper into this silent schizophrenia where everything seemed to transform, to fold in on itself, and the truth to hide itself more and more at every moment. The world that once seemed solid and familiar now felt like an illusion, a web of shadows that captured his mind and body. Between what he saw and what he heard, he could no longer distinguish. Everything merged and disintegrated, leaving him completely lost in his own altered perception. Ethan realized, with a hint of dread, that his senses, his eyes, ears, and mind were being manipulated by a dark force, capable of transforming what is tangible into pure illusion. And in a silence that seemed greater than the world itself, he wondered if he would ever be able to return to a reality where he could trust something beyond the shadows that insisted on becoming more and more real. That night, Ethan knew that the final confrontation had arrived. All his struggle, his doubts, his fears, everything he accumulated over the weeks seemed to converge on that moment. The surrounding forest seemed more alive than ever, with shadows that stretched and writhed, as if trying to block his passage or lure him into an abyss of no return. His steps were steady, but his heart beat with a mixture of fear and determination. He carried the only weapon he found suitable, a flashlight with a strong beam and an old axe, worn out by use, but safe in his hand. Every step on the trail felt like a battle, a desperate struggle against the unknown. Then, suddenly, a giant shadow emerged before him. It was not just a form, but a presence that seemed to absorb all the light, deforming the space around it. His red eyes shone brightly, fixating on Ethan as a pale, almost translucent silhouette moved sinuously, like a shadow serpent. The creature approached with frightening speed, its long hands reaching out like tentacles of darkness, wanting to grab Ethan. He instinctively raised his axe, trembling, but determined not to flee. The internal conflict screamed inside him, a visceral fear that it might all end there, crushed by the weight of that ancient force, but also a silent plea for resistance. He knew he had to face it, even though his mind was about to disintegrate. The creature moved forward, its movements precise, as if studying every weakness. Ethan screamed a mixture of anger and despair as he tried to keep a cool head. With all the strength he had left, he threw himself towards the shadow, striking with the axe. The creature tensed, letting out an inhuman sound, a mixture of moaning and distorted laughter. The physical fight was brutal, a battle of strength and endurance, but also a war in his own mind. Ethan felt the warmth of his own resistance. his hope of breaking through the shadow spell that seemed to try to devour him alive. His blows became more violent, more desperate, until with a last effort he managed to plunge the axe into the shadow that moved like a stream of smoke. A burst of black light and fragments of darkness spread out as the creature writhed, emitting a howl that seemed to whip its own soul. For a moment, all was silent. Ethan, exhausted and bloody, watched the form disappear, the threat dissipating into the night. But his internal conflict still remained. Was it really over? Or was it just the beginning of something even darker? His battle for survival had reached its apex, but the invisible mystery still hung in the air, unsettling his mind and heart, leaving him aware that although he had won the battle, the war against the occult forces had not yet come to an end. After the intense confrontation, Ethan lay there on the ground, breathing heavily as the shadow dissipated into the darkness. For a moment, the forest returned to silence, but his mind still vibrated with the emotions of that moment. He thought about the choices that brought him there, the courage that, even though he trembled, he managed to muster to face what seemed invincible. His fight had not been only against the creature, it had been an internal battle against fear, doubt, and sanity itself. Now, with the danger temporarily removed, he reflected on how much his perception had been distorted, how everything had changed in a matter of minutes. The environment, her emotions, the very reality that now seemed so fragile. Even so, a question still hovered around his mind. Was it really over? Or could that monster or force return at any moment, stronger, smarter, more adapted? The sense of vulnerability persisted, like a silent shadow that stretched beyond her own body, leaving Ali in doubt that her battle was not yet over. Ethan scrambled to his feet, feeling every muscle, way down, carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension. As he looked up at the dark sky, he noticed that the stars were beginning to appear timidly, as if trying to illuminate the uncertainty that hovered over him. The threat had been contained for now, but what had happened there left a deep imprint, a reminder that hidden evil is always lurking, ready to emerge from the darkness. With his heart racing, Ethan realized that although the present battle had been won, the invisible war against the unknown was still prolonged, and its effects might be far from over. The stillness of the night seemed to mark the end of a chapter, but it also made room for the return of danger, more subtle, more insidious. Thus, while the forest remained silent, Ethan knew that his struggle to understand and survive this supernatural threat was still far from over. The shadow had been banished for the time being, but the secrets it hid remained buried in the dim light, awaiting the next moment of awakening. Even after the shadow's omission and apparent victory, Ethan knew that his journey had only just begun. The clues he had found, scratched symbols, marks on the floor, the old notebook with accounts of a precursor, suggested that what he faced was much bigger than a simple creature of darkness. There were forgotten stories, secrets buried under layers of time and silence that were yet to be unraveled. Each discovery fueled a new doubt. Why did that force manifest itself precisely in that region? What is its real origin? And what is the connection with the ancient legends of native tribes, which spoke of beings capable of transforming, manipulating perceptions, and swallowing souls? Despite his fear, Ethan began to understand that this was not a passing presence, but an entity that seemed to evolve, adapting to human attempts to understand it. Ancient symbols pointed to forgotten rituals, to a force that, once awakened, could lie dormant for generations, waiting for the right moment to return with greater force. With each step, the mystery deepened, and the feeling that something greater had been released grew stronger and stronger. There were still more secrets, more untold stories, and Ethan suspected that the forest itself held these answers in the heavy silence of its shadows. The approach of a new cycle of terror seemed inevitable. What else would be hidden under the roots and among the trees? What ancestral forces manipulated reality, creating illusions and feeding an ancient evil? What he had witnessed was only a provocation, a spark that could ignite a greater catastrophe. His dreams began to be invaded by visions of deformed human figures, obscure symbols, and the echo of voices desperately trying to communicate or warn. When he examined the ancient inscription hidden on the basement wall, a cryptic message emerged. "The truth is in the shadows you can't see." The phrase became an unsettling truth, as Ethan realized that what he could not understand or even see possessed an incomprehensible power, and that it would reveal itself at the right time. He knew that there were forces that had not yet been fully awakened, and that his struggle was no more than an initial battle against something expanding in the shadows. With each new clue, he felt that history still had many chapters to write, secrets buried in the memory of those who inhabited those lands before him. And despite the apparent victory, one doubt persisted. Had evil really been driven out, or had it just temporarily slumbered? The answer remained hidden behind a curtain of shadows. Ethan wonders if he will ever understand all the darkness that lurked in the forest and in his own mind. Or if, perhaps, the real fear was just that there are secrets, forces, and horrors that would never be fully revealed, just waiting for the moment to re-emerge. Thus the mystery remains alive, and the next night may hide the next face of that dark evil, heavier and more enigmatic than anything he has ever seen. Thomas was a 35-year-old man, a former anthropologist who, after years of studying ancient peoples and their legends, decided to take refuge on a small farm in the Oregon countryside, away from the noise of the cities. His routine was calm and solitary, marked by long walks through the vast forest that surrounded his house, a wooden construction with large glass windows that seemed to hide secrets in the dim light. The surrounding environment was silent, but charged with a sense of mystery. During the day, Thomas explored the nearby areas, investigating ancient marks on rocks and trees, remnants of a forgotten history. At night, silence became an oppressive presence. A strange smell, like something sour and metallic, would begin to hang in the air even when nothing seemed unusual. On a particularly dark night, as yet another storm approached, Thomas heard a strange sound coming from the forest. It was an almost inaudible whisper, like a voice that seemed to be echoing from within the trees, calling him by name. Curious and restless, he tried to rationalize. It was the wind, some frightened animal, or just his imagination. But as he approached the edge of the woods, a sense of silently watching enveloped him. When he turned his head, he saw an elongated shadow which seemed not to belong to the natural environment, something tall with an undefined outline and bright eyes that reflected the little light of the moon. Thomas was paralyzed, the cold, sweat running up his back. That shadow, if it was really a creature, seemed to move slowly around him, as if studying his movements. He felt his body weigh down, as if the forest was trying to lock him there, in an invisible trap. Fear began to creep in stronger, not by a direct threat, but by an acute sensation that it was all more than a mere hallucination, that some ancient and evil force had awakened in those lands, and that she was watching him silently. Not sure whether to flee or stay, Thomas took a step back, feeling more and more consumed by a restlessness that increased by the moment. Nature itself seemed, in a subtle way, to transform the environment, as if it were coordinating with something hidden that night was trying to reveal itself. A dark crack in the landscape, an invisible threat began to creep in, making it clear that its presence was not mere imagination. In the heavy silence of the forest, Thomas felt that the story he believed in the rational world was beginning to dissolve. Something ancient and dark had awakened beneath the trees, and now he was at the center of a mystery that could change his life forever. The first night of that turbulent night was just the beginning of a journey that would bring to light horrors and secrets buried in the collective memory. And as the sky remained dark, Thomas knew that this silent menace was only preparing to show its true face. A face that was perhaps older than any known legend. In the days that followed that unsettling night, Lucas noticed that something strange was beginning to infiltrate his routine. Little things that once seemed insignificant have gained a disconcerting weight. As he walked through the farm, he began to notice deformed footprints on the earth, with marks that looked unlike any ordinary animal footprint. They were long, with a distorted silhouette, almost like a reflection of a human form, but with contours that seemed to elongate and transform before his eyes. At first, he tried to attribute everything to the wind or to his imagination, fueled by isolation and fatigue. But as the days wore on, these clues piled up, creating a constant sense that something was watching her actions, hidden beyond what her eyes could comprehend. The nights, once quiet, became his greatest source of discomfort. Luke began to hear noises that seemed to belong to nothing he could explain. Indistinct whispers blew in from the dark, almost like distant voices, and sometimes a quiet presence seemed to move among the trees, even without any sound. The next mornings, he would find scratch marks or scratches on the surrounding trees, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with him, or as if he were preparing for something bigger. Despite the growing sense of danger, Lucas tried to rationalize. Perhaps they were just frightened animals, or a manifestation of his own exaggerated fear. However, the certainty that this was more than a simple illusion was consolidated at every moment. One day, while exploring the perimeter of the property, he discovered an ancient structure, a kind of altar made of stone and branches, partially covered by earth. The environment around him seemed to be charged with a different energy, a weight that weighed on his chest. In addition to the visible marks, Lucas began to notice changes in the very nature of the environment. Trees that were once straight now had angular curves, and the wind seemed to carry whispers that multiplied, forming a kind of collective murmur. Dreams began to become more vivid, with visions of tall, pale figures with eyes that shone in the darkness, always watching from afar, always waiting to reveal themselves. Lucas tried to convince himself that everything was nothing more than his emotions on the surface, that his mind created figures that only existed in his head. But the clues piled up, and the feeling that something really ancient and powerful was awakening in the forest became almost unbearable. The mystery remained shrouded in a curtain of silence and shadows. His final doubt was whether it was all a manifestation of a supernatural force, or proof that the environment in which he lived hid secrets dark and too vast for him to understand. Each day, the invisible presence became more noticeable, and the fear that it could get out of control grew within him. Luke knew that, in spite of everything, the real danger was yet to come. He just couldn't understand what his true nature was. But one thing was certain. Something in that forest was still waiting for the moment to reveal itself completely, and he would certainly no longer be fully prepared for it. Each night that passed, Lucas felt the weight of fear intensify within him. The silence on the farm, once a comforting peace, now seemed like a cruel threat laden with gloomy omens. The shadows on the walls and in the forest beyond his house seemed more vivid, as if they had gained an intelligence of their own, watching him at every moment. His breathing became more difficult as panic seeped into his mind, pushing him to the edge of anxiety. Sometimes he thought he might be going crazy, that it was all just a manifestation of his own fear, an illusion created by loneliness and exhausting routine. But even so, the palpable sensations, the cold sweat, the racing heartbeat, that feeling of being constantly watched, were also undeniable. Lucas found himself in a battle between rationality and the feeling that something really dark and ancient threatened him. And with each day, the impression that danger was approaching grew stronger. Little things were beginning to prove his theory. The sound of heavy footsteps that seemed to echo closer. Footprints that multiplied in the mud around the farm. Scratch marks on trees whose origin seemed impossible to explain. An almost physical restlessness clung to him, an anguish that suppressed his ability to think clearly. He tried to calm himself, remembering logical explanations, animals, the effects of stress, his own imagination. But the feeling of helplessness only grew. She felt like cornered prey, surrounded by a force she could not understand or control. His dreams became vivid nightmares, where tall, pale figures with eyes that shone in the darkness, which he tried to scare away but couldn't, suddenly appeared and disappeared into the vastness of the forest. Every noise, no matter how small, seemed to announce some threat imminently, like an indecipherable threat that absorbed his peace of mind. His vulnerability increased as he felt that that entity, adapted to his fear, creating more, disturbing versions of his nightmare. The more he tried to rationalize, the more his mind became confused, entering a cycle of doubts. Was it all a manifestation of his own madness, or was he facing an ancient force beyond his comprehension? The feeling of helplessness grew, because he knew that no matter how hard he tried to run away or understand, something was there, in the dark, molding itself to his fear, strengthening itself in the dim light. Each shadow seemed to lengthen, each noise became more threatening, and the invisible threat became more and more concrete. Luke felt that despite all his attempts to keep a cool head, the strength of the one pursuing him was not only physical, but mental and spiritual. His anxiety became a heavy anchor, making it difficult to take every breath, every move. Fear overwhelmed him, an overwhelming presence growing around him, fueled by the shadows and the expectation of a threat that had not yet fully shown itself, but whose presence hoisted like a dark mist. Her heart, her mind, her body all seemed to be at the limit, while the feeling of vulnerability became more acute and unbearable. The hope of escaping fragmented, along with his sanity, leaving him at the mercy of an anxiety that seemed to want to devour him whole. As the days passed, Lucas noticed subtle changes in what he considered his limits. The shadows in the forest seemed to change, taking on unsettling forms that fit their deepest perceptions of fear. Small moles, a footprint that at night suddenly appeared on the ground, with marks that looked like a human footprint, but deformed and elongated too much. For an ordinary animal, sometimes a distant whisper seemed to turn into an almost inaudible melody, charged with an intelligence he couldn't explain. The forest, once an expanse of silence and peace, began to feel more alive than ever, as if it were breathing along, with a hidden force. Even when he tried to rationalize, his explanations became increasingly difficult to sustain. The signs multiplied. Trees that seemed to bend slowly in one direction, deep marks made with unusual force, daring to defy logic. Then Lucas realized that this strength was not just a manifestation of fear or frightened animals. They seemed to adapt, evolve, adjusting their movements and their appearances to his reactions, as if they were learning, waiting for the most opportune moment to reveal themselves completely. Still silent, the shadows lengthened, separating from the surrounding environment and taking on contours that hinted at something much older and more dangerous. As the days wore on, the threat grew in the same proportion. Whispers turned into muffled screams in his head, and the tall, pale figures he sometimes saw among the trees seemed to approach, changing shape, taking on more frightening, more menacing details. Lucas began to feel a presence he could not explain, a kind of force that silently shifted, that hid in the details of the environment and fed on the fear that it itself created. The signs intensified. A metallic smell in the air, footprints that disappeared and reappeared, shadows that stretched out like invisible tentacles, always adjusting to their emotions, always hiding in the dim light. And the more he tried to run away from fear, the more it seemed to come closer, like a force that not only adapted to his actions, but also to his deepest emotions. Luke understood that these creatures, or supernatural forces, were not mere illusions, but evolving entities that molded themselves to his limited understanding, becoming more concealed and dangerous. The forest looked like a living labyrinth, a trap where hidden forces hid and improved themselves. Without a clear explanation, he realized that the real danger was not just a static force, but an entity that adjusted to his perceptions and strengthened itself in the darkness. His fear grew in the same proportion because he knew that these forces were preparing for a greater revelation, a definitive manifestation that could change everything he knew about what is real or imagined. These forces were adapting, expanding their unseen domain, leaving Luke at the mercy of a threat that left no clear clues, only hints that ancient evil was preparing to show its true face in the shadows. As the days passed, Lucas began to feel that his own perception of the world around him slowly crumbled. Things that had once seemed clear and familiar now became distorted, almost unrecognizable. He looked at the trees, and they seemed to move subtly, as if they were moving of their own accord, adjusting in the dim light. The shadows, previously only a dark presence, seemed to lengthen, curve, and even take on shapes that reminded him of human figures, but distorted and deformed. It was difficult to distinguish what was real from what was the fruit of his mind, seething with fear. Increasingly, he found himself questioning his own vision. Was the shadow that seemed to hide among the trees an illusion created by his anxiety, or a force that actually molded itself in the darkness? The sounds also began to transform. The whisper of the wind turned into an indistinct conversation, almost like a murmur laden with incomprehensible words. Sometimes Lucas had the impression of hearing heavy footsteps or distant laughter. But when he paid attention, everything fell silent again, as if the world is playing with your head. The environment around him seemed to alter in ways he couldn't explain. The once straight trees slowly curved, forming twisting corridors that seemed to lead him somewhere or nowhere. The marks he found on the earth, initially strange, now seemed to change place or disappear, as if hiding in reality itself. The feeling of being lost increased every day. He didn't know if it was all a hallucination or a manifestation of something much more sinister. The lines between what he saw and what he imagined began to blur. At times, Lucas had the feeling that the entire forest moved to face him, that the shadows were getting closer than his eyes could perceive, a presence that fed on his doubt and disorientation. His senses were confused. Daylight, which had previously seemed normal, now seemed charged with a distorted luminosity, as if space itself were deforming. With each step, he had the impression that something invisible was changing around him, hiding and adjusting to his altered emotions and perceptions. His vision became a haze of vague images, of shadows that moved almost imperceptibly, of sounds that folded in his head, leaving him more and more confused. Lucas wondered if it was all just the manifestation of his fear, or if an ancient force was actually manipulating his reality, creating illusions to keep everything hidden. The more he tried to define what was real, the more he got lost in the labyrinth of distortions. The forest, which once seemed so solid and reliable, now seemed like a reflection of his own fragmented mind, a mixture of nightmare and reality. At every moment, he felt that his perception was being manipulated by something beyond human understanding, a force that adapted to his fear, hiding in the dim light, waiting to fully reveal itself. And the more he tried to distinguish what was felt from what was imagined, the greater his disconnection, until everything merged into a single distorted perception, leaving his world more and more confused, more insecure, and more frightening. In total darkness, Lucas knew he could not run away any longer. Everything had converged to that moment of confrontation. The shadows around him seemed to move, forming distorted and menacing figures that stretched towards him like tentacles of an ancient force. His heart was beating wildly, feeling his muscles tense and his blood pumping hard. With a cry of resistance, he seized a large stone beside him and with all the strength he could muster, threw it against the nearest shadow. The creature, which had a fluid and almost ethereal form, shuddered, as if it had been struck by a palpable force. But she did not retreat. Rather, her presence intensified, becoming a pulsating, living mass of darkness. Lucas felt a wave of dread mixed with a hint of hopelessness. It was as if he was fighting something that he learned and evolved in silence, adapting to his fear, to his strategies. His mind struggles to stay focused. He knew he couldn't just defend himself with physical strength. He had to break the spell or the connection that force had with him. Sighing deeply, he tried to recall the words he had heard in the ancient legends, a hope that bravery and determination could weaken evil. In a last-ditch effort, he grabbed an old amulet, a relic of his grandfather, with strange symbols engraved on it, and held it tight, refusing to give in to fear. His voice, almost a whisper, echoed in the night. "I will not let you take me." The mutant shadow responded with a deep howl, a mixture of distorted screams and laughter, as their forms multiplied and writhed. At that moment, an internal battle also took place. Lucas struggled with his own doubt, his feeling of powerlessness in the face of something that seemed older than time itself. The invisible force that threatened him continually tried to consume his hope, but he refused to give in. With the final decision to face it to the end, he advanced with the axe, reaching the greatest of all shadows. An explosion of darkness spread, a wave that seemed to engulf everything around, and a silent scream resounded in his head. When everything calmed down, Lucas fell to his knees, exhausted but alive. The threat seemed to have been banned, at least, for now. Silence once again dominated the forest, but he knew, deep in his heart, that reality would never be the same. The fight was over, but the inner war remained. The shadow could return, stronger and more disguised. His body trembled with exhaustion and fear, while his mind struggled between temporary relief and the certainty that this evil had not been truly destroyed. Lucas had faced the force of the supernatural, but the real conflict began within him, in the hope that one day he would be able to understand all that darkness. And yet, a doubt persisted. Was that evil presence really destructive, or just a piece of something bigger, waiting for its next move in the shadows? After the explosive confrontation, Lucas fell to his knees in the dark, damp forest dirt, his body tired and his mind tumultuous, trying to process what had just happened. For a few moments, everything seemed to calm down and return to the same oppressive stillness that once seemed to be on the verge of swallowing everything. But even so, he knew that the calm was only apparent. The threat, though momentarily removed, remained there, in the air laden with mystery and unresolved terror. Slowly, he stood up, breathing deeply, trying to regain his sense of reality. His Head was still throbbing from the effort of confronting something so ancient and insidious, a force that adapted, that camouflaged itself in shadow and silence. His thoughts wandered between the relief of being alive and the weight of a responsibility that seemed greater than he could bear. The marks left on the earth, the deformed footprints, the symbols scratched on the trees, now seemed even more distant, almost like echoes of a bad dream. But as much as he wanted to convince himself that it was all over, a persistent doubt remained. Had he really repelled evil, or had he only postponed what was yet to come? The surrounding forest, which had once revealed itself as a living entity, now seemed silent, but his attentive eyes could pick up on details that seemed to promise a later or stronger return. Lucas looked up at the dark sky, trying to understand what it all really represented. The battle had been won, but the internal war, the fear, the doubt, the sense of powerlessness still perpetuated itself within him, a shadow that never completely dissipated. As he walked away from that spot, each step seemed to weigh more than the last. His head still hammered him with images of warped shapes, whispering voices, and a force that had molded itself to his emotions. Even with his body exhausted, his mind insisted on looking for answers, trying to understand what that confrontation really meant. The memory of the moment when he had rebelled his resistance, even with his heart racing, was like a flame of hope. Perhaps, he thought, the strength of this evil was greater than anything, but his courage had created a gap, a chance to fight. Still, the fear of a return, darker, more powerful, accompanied him. Each step on the silent trail led him to a future of uncertainty, where the threat still loomed in the shadows, hidden, waiting for its next move. The silence of the forest seemed like a reminder that our greatest enemy is often what we can't see, a danger that evolves, adapts, and can creep back in when you least expect it. Lucas knew that the battle was over for now, but the real conflict would continue within him, doubting and hoping that one day he would be able to understand all that darkness. Until then, all that remained was a sense of uncertainty, the fear that this shadow, though momentarily gone, would never truly disappear. After the final confrontation, Lucas remained there, victim of a heavy silence that seemed to engulf the entire forest. Despite the apparent relief, an uncomfortable feeling insisted on taking root in his mind. He knew that the evil he had faced had not been completely destroyed. Small clues began to emerge little by little, fragments that reinforced the idea that this was just a tip of a much larger iceberg. He found marks and symbols on the trees, none of them completely understandable, but charged with an energy that seemed to pulsate in the distance. The marks eluded any logical explanation. Old scratches, patterns that looked more like a message than a mere scratch on the bark of the tree. In his notebook, a note from a former local resident caught his attention. Stories of a force that fed on fear, capable of molding itself in the shadows, of manipulating reality, and of hiding in the very false light that he believed existed. Each discovery seemed to reinforce the feeling that the conflict he had fought was only one battle among many, a fight that would drag on in a shadow that will never really fade. But there were still many secrets to unravel. Who or what, really, were these entities? How did they reproduce or become stronger? And why did all that happen right there, in that region forgotten by almost everyone? The feeling that the occult forces were still active and possibly evolving became stronger and stronger. The ancient symbols that Luke had seen in the ancient ruins, the marks on the earth that changed shape in his absence, and the shadows that twisted in the night, suggested a power that adapted itself to his attempts at combat. In his anxiety, he was sure that those forces were not mere legends, but entities that still remained dormant, waiting for the moment to awaken again. Moreover, he supposed that his own intervention had been only a test, an attempt to understand his true nature. What else remained hidden? What secrets were buried beneath the old records, in the forgotten beliefs of ancient tribes, or even in something he didn't have the courage to explore? His latest discovery was a stone inscription, almost invisible, that read, "Truth hides where light does not reach." That seemed like a clue, a message to someone who was willing to look beyond what he saw. Truth, Lucas thought, was a piece that was never complete, a flower that grew in the shadow. And he knew that, as much as his fear and courage led him to this mystery, he would never have all the answers. The occult forces were there in the dim light, waiting for an opportunity to return. And as silence prevailed in the forest, a subtle whisper seemed to come from the ground itself, like a promise that the greatest secret was yet to come. Something older, darker, and more powerful than anything he had seen before. In that moment, Luke realized that the real battle was not only against these creatures, but against the very mystery that fed them, a force that was renewed in the darkness beyond the reach of any comprehension. The secrets remained buried in the shadows, waiting for the moment to emerge again. And he, silently, felt that this shock of reality was just the beginning of something that would change everything. The real horror was yet to come. So did you like the story? So you know, right? Subscribe to the channel now. Activate the bell so you don't miss any of the next dark adventures to come. Come be part of our crowd, because here there are more. Mysteries, more terror, and many surprises that only those who follow are aware of. Let's leave that light to strengthen. Comment what you think and share with friends who enjoy a chilling story. You can't miss it, huh? So, click there and come with us on this journey to discover what lurks in the shadows.